Welcome everyone. Welcome to the Dev Talk series. My name is Tim O'Brien. I'm a Senior Manager of Applied Research at the Growth Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'll be moderating this session called A New Agenda for African Continental Integration with Dr. Donald Kaberuka, former president of the African Development Bank. Dr. Kaberuka, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So the first question I have for you is simply about the current state of growth in Africa. For many African nations, growth remains slow in 2021, and current IMF and other forecasts don't project Africa as a whole to converge to its pre-COVID growth path, unlike many other regions. Can you talk to us about Africa today in the context of the pandemic? Do you think African economies have begun to recover from the COVID-19 crisis?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share. And I apologize for the lights. As I said, I'm being from Brussels at this EU Africa Summit. So some challenges with cameras, but I hope we can have a conversation which is audible. Look, let me make two caveats. Caveat number one, Africa is 55 countries. And therefore, you're likely to have a whole variety of post-COVID recovery, depending upon a whole number of things. And so as we talk about African recovery, please bear in mind there are 55 countries, and there will be different possibilities, positions, and I suspect the recovery will be as varied as the number of countries we have. The second caveat is that we cannot explain everything on COVID. In some cases, there are some pre-existing vulnerabilities caused by either internal or external factors. So it cannot be that COVID explains everything that will be happening in the next year also. So that was my second caveat. Now, why do I say this? I'm saying this because I'm still confident that many of our countries can recover, but it will be a recovery which is probably as variable as it was in the past. I think some countries do better than others, depending upon 4 factors. Factor number one, the path of this virus. Shall we see another variant of this virus? No one knows. I see that European countries are beginning to open up the economies to, eliminate all these measures in the belief that maybe Omicron will not lead to another variant. So that is issue number one. Issue number two will be the rate of vaccination, which in what you call Africa is still very low, less than 10%. Now, some countries, including my own, are right on targets, WHO targets, but many other countries are below 10%. So that will be the second factor. The third factor will be what is happening to the global economy. And at the moment, a number of things are really impacting the recovery path. And one of them, you don't be surprised via the supply chains. These 4 issues the world over. We're struggling with supply chains and maybe possible risk of inflation. I don't know. And then the last one is the multilateral action. Because we saw during the acute phase of COVID, a lot of disjointed, not robust responses compared to what happened in the economies in the global north, where trillions of dollars were put out there as stimulus. Many of our countries don't have that possibilities. They did what they could, but I want to say that international response was muted, with the exception, I would say, of the International Monetary Fund and institutions like the Global Fund. But I would like to see much more robust action going forward, so that there could be a synchronized recovery, not simply recovery in the north, but recovery in the north and the global south as well.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what a more robust effort would look like? I know that early in the pandemic, you argued with others for the need for debt relief in Africa. Do you think debt relief is still needed? What's the economic case for debt relief, or what are the broader ways that the multilateral response can be more robust?
Let me qualify that statement. What was requested for and was delivered by the G20 was not debt relief understood to be debt cancellation. It was a debt standstill. It was a moratorium which was voluntary and temporary. It was understood that after the acute phase of COVID is over, countries will begin again to fulfill their responsibilities. Many countries, by the way, did not take up the moratorium because they were keen to ensure that as part of the recovery process, they continue to have access to global capital markets. And you and I know that some rating agencies had not taken kindly to the initiative of the moratorium, let alone that the moratorium was not comprehensive, i.e. covering all the creditors. So no, we never called for debt relief. We called for a debt standstill, a moratorium, which is temporary and voluntary. Now, I want to emphasize here that there are indeed a number of countries who have issues of debt distress or at the margin of debt distress. But that was not exactly linked to COVID. In many of those cases, it pre-existed COVID. COVID only worsened the situation. And therefore, the solution there might include some degree of debt restructuring, but also a little of macroeconomic reform and policy reforms. These things have to go together. But you ask me what a robust action could be, I give you one, which has been on the table for 18 months now, with very little movement. It's on the issue of the special drawing rights, the reserve asset of the International Monetary Fund. You recall that during the global financial crisis, a decision was made to increase the level of special drawing rights from around $24 billion, close to $250 billion. Very robust, very robust. This time around, we would have looked for something of equal measure. Now, a decision was taken to increase the special drawing rights to about 630 billion equivalent. But as you know, because of the way the quota regulations work, African countries got only about $33 billion. By the way, a large part of which went to the middle-income countries. So the majority of countries with the smaller economies, smaller quotas, got very little in terms of the SDRs. And a proposal has been put on the table by different parties to say there'll be a lot of countries in the G20 who don't need those SDRs, who don't need them, that a part of those SDRs should be recycled, all right, and the mechanism to be discussed to those countries who need them. That would be a very bold decision, which is not technically difficult. There's some legal issues, but it's more about the political will to say there's been this decision on the special drawing rights, but it is benefiting countries who actually don't need them. Let us recycle at least $100 billion to low-income countries and low- and middle-income countries to assist in the recovery. Those kind of measures will be quite salutary.
And then what about any other actions from other multilaterals? And what about the African Development Bank itself? What roles do you see from the other major institutions?
So regional development banks play a very big role. They have knowledge on the ground. They have done quite a lot in assisting countries in this period. But you know, also their capital base is narrow. Their resource base is not commensurate with the size of this crisis. So part of the arguments on the SDRs is to say these SDRs should be recycled via Africa's development institutions, right? Not the only ones, but a large part of it through the African public development banks. And therefore, I hope and expect that some decision in that direction will be taken.
Great. Let's turn a little bit to the topic of this session on African continental integration. But I think that'll bring us back to some of the other components of recovery that you mentioned already. So as the global economy changes now, the aftermath of COVID-19, supply chain issues, but also the move toward decarbonization, what's the space of capabilities for global competitiveness that you see emerging through African integration? I guess including, but not limited to, through the African Continental Free Trade Area.
So let me explain. The logic of the Continental Free Trade Area is straightforward. It's about deepening Africa's markets. It's about extending the diversity of those markets. Some economies are very small. I'm not saying small economies cannot prosper, but I think, as you have seen in other parts of the world, a decision to come together, removing barriers to trade and investment, is quite salutary in order to see going around the world. Let me explain this way. As you know, there are several stages of integration. The lowest one is known as the preferential trade area. You reduce your tariffs among members, but you don't completely eliminate them. The next one is a free trade area, where you remove trade barriers among the members. All right? Then you can move on to the customs union, where you have got a common external tariff. You could move on to a monetary union, and even later, a full economic union, including a standard. Now, many African regions have actually moved beyond the free trade area. Some of them have common currencies. Others have customs union. Others in monetary union. And therefore, the African Continental Free Trade Area brings coherence among all the 5 regions of Africa. Those who are at the early stages, like the preferential trade areas, those who are moved to the higher stages, like the monetary union. So we're not building on nothing. We're building on something which already exists. But now the idea is to bring coherence between the regions. And we know that tariffs are actually no longer the biggest problem. The weighted average tariff among many African countries today would be in the neighborhood of 12–13%. But the real barrier to trade are things like the payment systems, movement of people, lack of a single air market, again, a lot of non-tariff restrictions, which you know very well. And the idea is that in this CFTA, each can move quickly to offer the liberalization which is provided for, including measures to safeguard those sectors which might be having some temporary concerns. You know, for example, it delayed 1 or 2 countries to sign the CFTA. Once with the issue of rules of origin, issues of anti-dumping measures, the standard things you have to deal with in this kind of arrangement. And my hope and expectation is that quickly we get all these things in place, all right? Some are more difficult than others. Movement of people is always very difficult, not simply in Africa, all over the world. But there are low-hanging fruits. We launched about a month ago in Accra, the Pan-African payment system, which is spearheaded by the African Import-Export Bank, a hugely important step, which enabled trading in national currencies without going initially through third currencies. I hope and expect we can make progress, for example, on that, payment systems and digital platforms. I'm hoping we can make progress on the single air market, which would bring down the cost of travel in Africa down by almost 40%. So integration is never easy, whether it is in Europe, as you can see, or other parts of the world. It requires a lot of give and take, but at the end of the day, we're all benefiting. And so the single logic of this CFTA is that it provides the resilience which the African economy needs against external shocks, and also increasing its capacity to attract investment from other parts of the world.
I wanted to ask you more about this last point of investments from other parts of the world. So what's your hope in some of the either sectors that are likely to emerge or trade relationships that are likely to become more promising. What's the nature of the types of investment that you hope that integration can enable? And is it investment that then produces things that are sold to this larger, more integrated African market that than certain countries have had access to before? Or is it also about producing things in Africa that are then sold to the rest of the world? What's some of the scope of possibility that's in your mind?
So, Tim, you and I know that intra-African investment flows themselves are very, very important. There are many companies of African origin, African ownership, which are beginning to cross borders. So part of the CFTA logic is that it encourages intra-African investment itself, all right? It's as important as attracting foreign investment. Now, the second thing you and I know is that a lot of investments over the last 25 years in many parts of Africa was going to extractives, mining, oil and gas, that kind of stuff, all right? Now, that means that we continue to be subject to vagaries of international commodity booms and busts, all right? So going forward, the really key issue is how do we join the global value chains at higher levels? Because right now, many economies are operating at lower levels of the global value chain. That's where the issues are. Now, it could be in the digital space, it could be in agribusiness, it could be in the consumer industry, it could be in healthcare, anything. But we have to be able to move up the global value chains. Now, it was beginning to happen in a number of countries, all right? Especially in the digital area. But now, as you can see, COVID itself has provoked some thinking around what do we do with vaccine manufacturing therapeutics, diagnostics. Now, for a continent which in 2040, 50 will be quite a powerhouse, a demographic powerhouse, it cannot be that would not become part and parcel of the high levels of the global value chains. Those are the kind of investments I'm talking about. It takes a number of things. It takes stability, it takes security, it takes skills, it takes the policy frameworks in place. All those things are within the CFTA. And I'm completely convinced that given Africa's mega trends, the demographics, the urbanization, the leapfrogging on some of these digital issues, Africa will be, once the CFTA is in place, quite the power to reckon with if everything in terms of sequencing will get it right.
So that brings us to the obvious follow-up questions of what are some of the risks and constraints to these initial building blocks of the CFTA being completed and put in place? What are some of the challenges that you see that need to be overcome for this powerhouse future?
Look, Tim, look at how long it has taken the European Union to get where it is today. The beginning of 1952 or 3 was a European coal and steel arrangement. They moved on to the Treaty of Rome, creating the economic community. They moved on to Maastricht, and then recently the Treaty of Lisbon. But not all European countries belong to the European Union. Some are in the Euro, they are not in the Union. Others are in the Union, they are not in the Euro. Okay? And there are other kind of arrangements with other European countries, including the free trade area, by the way. As you see, it's quite a long journey, complicated. Economies are different. Data has to be taken into account. There will always be a bit of zero-sum calculus as well. There'll be some fears to overcome. But whether it is Latin America, whether it is Europe, whether it is Asia, integration is a journey which is complex. We should not underestimate the challenges that it takes, especially when we're talking about 55 countries. Again, look at how long it has taken Europe and look at the challenges they are still having even today. And therefore, I think building on what has been happening in different parts of Africa already, in East Africa, in ECOWAS, in SADC, especially those, SADC, ECOWAS, East African community, where significant steps had been taken, up to customs union, up to the monetary union in case of some countries in West Africa. So we shall be building on what exists already, but not underestimating the challenges we face.
And how about challenges in particular to some of the low-hanging fruit that you mentioned before? Payment systems, air travel, mobility. What are some of the more immediate hurdles to get past there?
So I mentioned the Pan-African Payments Scheme, which a number of financial institutions, central banks have already joined, others in the process of that. It requires good preparation. It's not easy, especially because different regions already have different arrangements of payments and settlements. And therefore, it is important to have this continental payment scheme building what exists already. So that takes a bit of time. Then there'll be issues like data protection, AML, that be all kind of need to get all the switches together. There's some practical and policy issues which have to be put in place. What I'm telling you is that our central banks, different financial institutions, and our Continental Exim Bank are working very hard on these issues. And I was really impressed by how far it has gone in such a short period of time. Just imagine that 3 African countries with different currencies can settle payments in real time using own currencies, all right, through the arrangements by the Exim Bank. That will not only save money, it will not only save the need to go through always third-party currencies, but over time, it will even bring the informal trade into formality, which, by the way, is estimated at over 50 billion. So even bringing informal trade into the formal structures, that itself will be a huge addition to our economic foundation. So they are low-hanging fruits, but I'm not saying they're easy to operate on day one.
In terms of mobility, not only of people, but also of goods, how about transportation gaps, infrastructure gaps? What are the key gaps that relate to the fulfillment of the goals of integration? How should we be thinking about those issues?
Look, infrastructure is, of course, a challenge because it costs money. But I want to tell you that in the 10 years spent in the African Development Bank, I saw huge progress in all regions of Africa, maybe except 2, the Manu River area and maybe some places in the Horn. But other parts of Africa, connectivity, whether it is for transport, for power, for fiber optics, all this has improved dramatically, bring down the cost of doing business everywhere. Now, that will continue. But I mentioned the single air market, because single air market does not require a lot of additional infrastructure, because you need airports. But those airports exist. But our planes have to fly to them using different levels of freedom, as was agreed in the Yamoussoukro agreement. So there are some things which does not require a lot of infrastructure. Let me give you one example. If today it was agreed that the power pools, which you know very well, work effectively, not only would that make it possible for our country to get energy security, but the chances are to bring down energy prices. And that is about the infrastructure, but it's more than infrastructure. It's about the policy frameworks. It's about the financial capability of the national off-takers. It's about regulations. It's about tariffs, right? It's how we administer subsidies. So there are many things we can do in the policy space, all right? While, of course, we work on the hard infrastructure. And again, I want to mention that I think a lot of progress has been made, and I'm certain that in the context of the free trade area, we can even do more.
And can you tell us a little bit about what the key roles are that the African Development Bank plays in this process? You mentioned your time briefly in relation to infrastructure. What are some of the key roles?
Look, it's a long time ago I left the African Development Bank. So I can't speak for the institution. I don't have that mandate. But I can speak as a former leader of that institution that it continues to play a very important role in the space of bringing down the cost of doing business in Africa and bring down the risk of doing business in Africa. Yeah, these regional institutions are very, very important. And the African Development Bank has played its role, continues to play its role, and I hope that its shareholders continue to resource it even more so that it can play its role with sub-regional development institutions. Remember, the creation of the African Development Bank followed a logic which was the colonial powers left us 55 countries, right? Several currencies, borders, and all. And the political decision was it will be complicated to open up the Pandora box of those borders. But let us accelerate integration. Let us create institutions which can bring down the cost of doing business in Africa and integrate our economies. And I want to salute the forefathers of our organization for that kind of foresight. They have continued. During this crisis, some of the organizations which are really have been first class, first in class, have been African organizations. African Center for Disease Control. Everybody agrees. Now the creation of the African Medicine Agency, the African Vaccine Acquisition Team, all this under the umbrella of the African Union, the African Import-Export Bank. These African institutions require support. The African Development Bank, African Export-Import Bank, African CDC, the AirVat, the Medicine Agency, in the context of this continental free trade area, we shall need those institutions to be strong, robust, and resilient.
So what about the potential losers of integration? I mean, there's a lot of benefits that you've laid out, but with the trade component, at least, there's always some winners and losers. How do you think about that? And how do you think about ensuring that those businesses or otherwise who might be harmed transform and benefit as well?
Look, we have to be extremely careful. I don't like the term winners and losers in the process of integration. Everybody is a winner. The zero-sum calculus is a wrong calculus. Everybody is a winner. Now, I'm not talking about that every single sector, every single enterprise will win. But there are some enterprises which maybe are operating inefficiently, right? Which cannot compete with imports from next door. Okay, that will increase consumer welfare. Okay, that means some business may have to readjust. That is a normal process of change. All right. Now, the CFTA does not offer 100% liberalization. It is a sequenced liberalization, recognizing some of those fears you mentioned, providing for, all right, until they organize those restructuring I'm referring to. There are very strong anti-dumping measures in case of fears by some countries that third-party exports would actually end up in their countries undermining their own industries. But I do believe that experience has proven, even within Africa, within our regional economic communities, that there is no loser. Everybody is a winner, all right? Provided we agree on those sequencing, timing, and phasing measures.
I'd like to ask you were you surprised at the level of support and unity across African nations in regards to AfCFTA? I mean, it struck me as unique in how many countries have signed on. Did that surprise you?
No, it didn't surprise me. Actually, it was exciting in the sense that the leadership of all our countries had been waiting for such measures. As I was saying, many regions have already gone even further than the free trade area. They are the customs union, they are the monetary union, the economic union. They have gone even further. Now the issue is to bring coherence among the 5 regions of Africa. Some are still at the beginning, others are much higher. But I did not see any hesitation. I just saw some countries wanting to have clarity on some of the risks which you mentioned, how those are addressed, how the protocols, different protocols on the rules of origin, on anti-dumping, on the clause, the called breaking clause, so many things. Once those had been explained, right, all countries are able to sign except one, I believe.
Great. So I think we're going to turn to participant questions soon. I wanted to pick up on vaccination again. You had mentioned it a little bit. You mentioned a little bit about vaccine manufacturing in your initial responses about COVID-19, one of the key pathways forward. Can you talk a little bit more about the vaccination challenge in Africa and other developing countries? How do systems need to improve globally, locally? Help us understand this challenge a little better.
So let me begin with the challenge which African countries face during this COVID crisis. Number one is that science and the private sector are able to provide a solution quickly in terms of vaccines, in terms of diagnostics, in terms of therapeutics. But then rich countries decided to hold, so to speak, all right, beyond even their needs, all right? And private companies were more keen to fulfill those orders and commitments than make sure that vaccines were equitably available around the world, all right? The situation has improved, but not as one would need to deploy the vaccines to the level needed. I really want to feel that when it comes to issues of diagnostics, therapeutics, export bans, hoarding by rich countries, right, did not help those of us who believe in free trade. I do believe that we have now to learn from this lesson, right? That when there's a crisis, right, global systems don't work as they're supposed to. And therefore, it's only normal that countries will look at making a significant level of therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines. All right. Now, it's not easy. It's complicated technologies, setting them up. But you see countries like Senegal, Rwanda, South Africa, Tunisia, Ghana already beginning to look into these mRNA technologies, not simply for COVID vaccines, but for other forms of vaccine. And here again, the free trade area really provides a very good base to do that, because it means we'll be able to manufacture these vaccines and exchange them among themselves and prepare for pandemics in the future. These things are at the beginning. Countries are working with different suppliers of technology. There have been the issue of intellectual property rights, which is also underway in terms of discussion. There have been different arrangements pending when that kind of issue is resolved. But it cannot be that in the future pandemic, and there will be, that African countries face the same problem they face this time of almost becoming the last mile in terms of vaccination.
I want to ask you just one more question, then we'll turn to all the questions that are coming in through the Q&A and keep them coming. And that's on your role as UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement. You know, it's clear that African integration can be an enabler to solving so many problems, economic and otherwise, public health. Is there a connection here with the challenges of internally displaced people? And if not, what are some things that are at the forefront to you on addressing internal displacement?
Okay, so when the Secretary General asked me and Federica Mogherini former EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, to co-chair this panel. This is what he said. Number one, the numbers of internally displaced persons in the world is at a historical high. People talk of 17 million people thereabout. That is a historical high. And let me also emphasize that an internally displaced person is still in their own countries. They have not crossed borders. They have been displaced either because of conflict or because of climate or because of both. But they're still within their borders. They are not refugees because they have not crossed a border. So the second reason Secretary General mentioned was that even though the numbers of IDPs in the world now are at record high, the world is not giving it enough attention, say, as we give to issue of refugees and the illegal migrants, which of course is important. But there are protocols, the international treaties on how you deal with refugees, but there's no such a thing on how you deal with internally displaced persons. So, number one, the numbers are at historical high. Number two, the issue is not receiving attention. And when it does receive attention, it receives attention from a viewpoint of humanitarian possibilities and assistance, not as a development issue. And therefore, we wanted to give it both a humanitarian side, a development side, and integrate it within thinking about what it means for the Sustainable Development Goals. We gave a proposal to the Secretary General, which is studying. I think it's a hugely important issue. From countries as varied as Colombia, from countries as varied as Philippines, from Myanmar, from Syria, from Yemen, from the Sahelian region, and from some countries in the Great Lakes. So it's an issue of huge importance globally, not simply for low-income countries. And I do believe that the proposals we gave to the Secretary General on how to ensure the issue internally displaced persons comes back on the agenda, all right? As is the one of refugees and migrants. And second, that it is looked at from the viewpoint of climate and conflict, and also from the viewpoint of development and humanitarian needs. So it's up to Secretary General now to carry the recommendations forward. But I do believe that in 2022, unless we begin to focus on the issues of IDPs, as I said, from places varied as Colombia, as Haiti, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Philippines, it will be very hard to achieve SDGs in some of those countries.
Thank you for that. So I see that Ricardo has joined now, so let me hand the floor over to him for as many questions as he'd like to ask.
Welcome, Donald, to this group. It's great that you're doing this for us. Thank you very much for your wisdom and your friendship all these years. I want to start by a brief comment and ask you a question on that. I think that whenever African countries, whether it's because of an export boom or aid or an ability to borrow, whenever sort of like the foreign exchange constraint gets lifted, it has shown an enormous capacity to grow. And whenever the foreign exchange constraint binds again, then things slow down. So you mentioned the word leapfrogging. I want to see, given your experience and your knowledge of the region and what you think is happening, what are the most promising opportunities that are there that you think countries should get organized to exploit out there? There's obviously, decarbonization is a challenge, but it may open opportunities. Digitalization, other things. You mentioned urbanization, demographic change. What are, in your mind, the best cards that countries in the region have right now to play in terms of a growth agenda?
Ricardo, thank you very much, first of all, for your kind words. Ricardo, it's hard to explain this to you because you explained very well in your courses in Harvard to your students and on your complex issues and what these economies have to do. But let me say three things. Number one, you're right about our economies having been basically subject to booms and busts of commodity cycles. That is a fact. However, I wanted to say to you, Ricardo, that just before COVID, in particular before the global financial crisis, some of the fastest growing economies in Africa were not commodity rich. In fact, when you look at numbers side by side, the fastest growing economies actually had very little in terms of oil, gas, and minerals. While those rich in those subsoil possibilities had just hugely volatile growth over the years. That suggested to me something, that if you look at the structure of sources of growth of those countries I'm referring to, it was interesting to see how they are related to the mega trends happening in Africa, which is demographic dynamics, young population. Second, population moving from rural areas to urban areas, which means the demand for literally everything in a new format. And thirdly, this issue of impact of simple technologies, like the mobile phone, what it has meant in terms of financial inclusion, what it has meant in terms of delivery of services. In my country, it has made a huge difference, for example, in health delivery. So I believe we have to look at what are the mega trends in Africa in the next 20, 30 years. And these are some of those I've mentioned. And what do they mean in terms of training, skills development, so that we can provide the response to them. Now, we have just mentioned two, which are critical: the green economy, right? The green economy. We don't have to build cities like were built in the past. We have to make sure that, given that Africa is actually very rich in green energy sources, right? That Africa is rich in some of the commodities which will be critical in this transition to electrical vehicles and stuff like that. That we manage this transition differently from what we've done in the past. So I think the two you have mentioned, the green economy and digital, are absolutely vital. But it means that we have to invest in what it takes to have that happen. Next time you visit my country, Ricardo, you'll be able to see that the investment the country has made to prepare a good digital infrastructure, good regulations, training people is what is making the country able to attract a lot of players in the higher value chains of the digital space. So you mentioned two, and I agree, the green economy and the digital space.
Thank you. Let me return it back to Tim O'Brien.
Thank you. Okay, so there's a lot of great questions in the Q&A. So I'll just go through as many as we have time for. So let me first read one from Daniel Ofosu, who's a mid-career MPA at the Kennedy School. And his question is, to what extent do you think historic national borders have contributed to the slow growth of intra-African trade? Going forward, do you believe that the CFTA has the requisite enforcement power to ensure that African economic regions cooperate fairly on trade issues?
Look, the fragmentation of our economies cannot but have been a break on possibilities of growth in Africa. No doubt about it. I'm not saying that large economies in Africa have necessarily done better than smaller economies. No, far from it. In fact, some of the large economies have done over a long period of time not well compared to the smaller economy. But we could have done better things together. And this is why I'm saying that when you look at parts of Africa which had been moving up steadily on the ladder of integration, like the East African community, all right? The rate of growth in the East African community region was much, much higher than, say, in Central Africa or North Africa, which is least integrated. In the North African countries, internal trade is about less than maybe 7%, or even lower than that. Same for some parts of Central Africa. So you could see the link between countries which are moved up faster and higher in cooperation and the impact on economic growth. Now, will it be easy? No, not at all, because of historical, geographical, and sometimes political factors as in Northern Africa. So the answer is yes, fragmentation has come at a cost. Would it be easy to overcome it? I think the CFTA is a very good starting point.
Okay, and our next question comes from Jasmine Higo, who is a graduate student at Cornell and I believe of Ethiopian descent, which is one country that's not participating in EAC. And her question is about regional economic communities. She says, thank you for this informative talk. What will happen to the existing regional economic communities and other African regional trading agreements under AfCFTA?
Okay, so for a long time, we have suffered this thing we call the spaghetti balls of federation. You find that every country, maybe some countries belong to more than 1, 2, 3, 4 economic configurations. One of the beauties of the CFTA is that it helps resolve that. This is called the spaghetti ball, because of harmonizing regulations, harmonizing tariffs, rules, etc., etc. So I think the CFTA is precisely an answer to these spaghetti balls, i.e., countries having to belong to several organizations because they have got several neighbors, especially countries like mine, which are landlocked. You have to belong to organizations while all your neighbors belong to. So that is the answer. Now, what will happen to those organizations? The CFTA does not mean that existing organizations should be got rid of. To the contrary, the CFTA builds on existing institutions, correct? It ensures that where they have moved further than the CFTA, actually that is accelerated further. So some institutions in the long run, it may evolve in different directions. But the idea of the CFTA is not to scrap existing institutions, is to build on them.
I have another question here that asks about the relationship of more integrated Africa with the rest of the world, and that's from Noah Asfaw. Should the AfCFTA prioritize working towards a continent-to-continent free trade agreement with the EU, or focus on intra-African opportunities? He also asks, what should we expect from the Brussels summit?
That's an interesting one. Yeah. Now, you know, look at the history of other parts of the world. Look at the history of Europe itself, right? At war twice in the last century. But once the war, Second World War was over, the Europeans decided no, they'll look for other ways of working together. So beginning with a few countries which were in the steel and coal community, then the EEC, and then of course the Treaty of Lisbon, and then integrating the countries in the former Soviet Empire in the Eastern Europe. Now, it has not been easy for them. And no one says it will be for us. But definitely it means priority for African countries is to build the continental markets, its diversity, its depth, to allow movement of capital, of labor, of services as much as we can. That is what make African countries able to withstand external shocks, also to negotiate better treaties, arrangements with other parts of the world. It will have to start at home. Look at the debate about the EPAs with the EU, economic partnership agreements, and the confusion that it created, i.e. each part of Africa negotiating a separate agreement with EU. It didn't work very well, precisely because it does not go into this logic. So the logic now is, let us open up the rest of the world, but let us first of all open up among ourselves, deepen our markets, allow free circulation of factors, and then negotiate with other parts of the world, as one of course will do, because that too is quite important.
Another question from Bruno Sergi. is what role should universities and research and development play in the African Union's economic development? And Bruno is a student at the Harvard Extension School.
So let's talk about education as a whole, not simply universities. And then we can talk about R&D. And then we can talk about intellectual property and patents. You know, since you are a student on those issues, I want to look at the development of patents in the world. Look at the development of patents in China alone in the last, say, 30 years. And try to link that to the level of investment in education, both at home and abroad. All right? Some of these successful countries realize they do not have enough possibilities of educating people at home, also invest in them being educated abroad, bring back the skills and the networks they have. Now, I do believe that the key issue in our system of education will be the quality at exit. Because we have done very well, including raising the number of children at school, girls and boys, increasing the number of universities, increasing the number of technical schools. But it's vitally important now to work on issues of ensuring that the quality at the exit is what exactly will enable us to get into the R&D space and everything that is the fourth industrial revolution, from nanotechnology to big data, the rest of it. So it's about, for me, providing universal opportunities for all children to go to school, and at the end of it, ensuring by the time when they leave at exit, they have the skills that are required for the economies of the future. This is how I see things from this angle.
Yeah, if I could build on the question a little bit, we think a lot about the interactions between universities, research universities, and the industries that are around them, and the role that universities play in the basic R&D that then feeds those industries and the interplay between the two. From that perspective, what do you think about what do you think about those type of relationships in across Africa? Are they growing in some places? What's the role of universities in this future of African integration?
So when we talk about the role of higher education as a whole, not simply universities, polytechnics, and any institution which provides skills at that level, we're not investing enough in R&D. All right. You know, you and I know that R&D around the world is subsidized often in different forms, including subsidies given to universities. And therefore, I do believe, again, back to the question, that the key issue is ensuring quality at the exit. And that means investing in the quality of education the kids get at school and in the universities. And along the way, figuring out a way in which to combine public money and private money to ensure that we invest more in R&D. I mean, at the moment, outside South Africa and probably Morocco, the level of investment in R&D is quite low. And this requires public money, private money, and of course, institutions of higher learning as well.
We are in the process here. You know, I'm speaking to you from a university in the United States of always in the countries where we work, trying to engage more with the universities located there in more collaborative ways of researching, especially the questions that matter more to local researchers. Have you seen some promising models of this type of relationship between global universities and local universities? What are your thoughts in this area?
Yeah, for example, here in my own country, Rwanda, there's an interesting model, actually two. One is the Carnegie Mellon University, which opened a campus in Kigali and provides master's degrees in the IT area. and they've done very, very well. You know, that is a kind of a cooperation which shows results. There's African Leadership University. There's the African Institute of Mathematics. So yes, there are possibilities of having those centers of excellence combining. But for me, the acid test is how well that works to build local capacities in Africa. Because remember, just look at the following number. If you train, say, an IT expert in an African country, say that makes maybe cost you what? Maybe say $2,000. If you send them to some Asian countries, that might be double, $4,000. If you send them to North America or Europe, you may end up paying 20 times, which means you can really educate so many. And therefore, the key will be how quickly you can build the capacities at home so you can get more people into the high learning framework. But now, if that happens by endogenous growth, it's better. And if it happens by this cooperating with external institutions, that is also quite useful. And why not?
Thank you. So I have a few different questions here about the relationship between AfCFTA and agriculture in particular. One question is about how the agreement will affect domestic agriculture and how to ensure adequate protection of farmers in competitive markets. Another question is actually asking about how the EU has a common agriculture policy and that's played a role in integration in the EU. Can you speak a little bit about the particular role that agriculture plays and how integration affects agriculture?
Look at it this way. If you go to many parts of Africa today, you find that rice being consumed is imported mainly from places like Vietnam. In many other parts, you find fish is imported from China. In many other parts, you find they're still importing things from European countries. Why? At least in the case of imports from Europe, because they are subsidized. Correct? So part of the solution has to come from an agreement at WTO level on market distorting agricultural subsidies. That's what will provide opportunities for African farmers. Should we, the United States, be still producing cotton, raw cotton? If you went to Mississippi and Alabama, I would like to ask this question. Is that something they should be doing in this century? Should the European countries be subsidizing their farmers at the level at which they do? Maybe the CAP was necessary in the 70s, but it is still necessary now. So there are those issues in the global agricultural policy, which would be a necessary complement to what we do in Africa. But I do believe that the CFTA is very good news for African farmers internally. Very good news for African farmers. Would they need protection? I'm not even sure about that. There might be some temporary arrangement for some products, which, by the way, is provided for in the CFTA. But overall, I think the more open our markets are to all our farmers, so that farmers from country A can sell their product country B and C and D, and not simply at raw level, by the way, but also at value-added levels. So I buy the thesis that actually CFTA is the best news for African farmers for a long time, provided those distortions in the global agricultural markets are dealt with as well.
I have a rather specific question here from Sanya Turlovich, which is, would you support the inclusion of the African Union in the G20, given that the EU is also a member? Would that help to increase the legitimacy of both AU internally and externally?
So is it right that a continent like Africa is completely left out of the discussions about the future of the world? That is the question to begin with. I happen to have attended the first G20 in London, called by Prime Minister Kaberuka. And because everybody realized the injustice of this, a way was found to ensure that there's some voice from the African side in the G20. So South Africa, of course, was there as South Africa. It is a large economy. But it was found to ensure that the African Union, the chairperson of the African Union, also attend, but as a guest. Equally, the head of the president who chairs the Nepal, the AU program, development program. But these are informal arrangements. It will be important to formalize them so that Africa has representation. But I would also end, is it right that a country like Bangladesh should be out, given its population weight? So maybe we should think of other informal arrangements. There have been so many since 1945. There was the G7, then the G7+1, then G8, then the G20. A way has to be found to combine effectiveness and legitimacy. At the beginning, the G20 was probably very effective at minimizing the damage caused by the global financial crisis, but its legitimacy is questioned by those of us who are left out. So would I call for inclusion of Africa? I would call for to make current arrangements binding, not simply inviting AU as guests, find a way by including more countries. There'll be a concern that more countries will mean a less effective decision-making capabilities. I don't agree. Even the current G20 arrangement, a number of decisions have been difficult to implement, right? In spite of the fact that there are only 20 countries who control 80% of the global economy. So I think ability to find a sweet spot between effectiveness and legitimacy is very fundamental.
Well, it's been a real privilege to hear your answers to all of these questions. You've been able to answer everything thrown at you quite quickly and compellingly. So I just want to leave the last few minutes, if you'd like, for you to share any thoughts that you'd like to leave us with, anything that you wish we asked about. Just like to leave the last word to you.
So I want to end where we began by thanking you, but also saying that what have we learned from this COVID crisis? We have learned many things. The first one is how badly the world was prepared to deal with this pandemic. It reminded me almost the history of HIV/AIDS. You and I know that HIV/AIDS has peaked in the global north from almost as early as 1995. The level of mortality from that particular pandemic peaked in 1995. Okay? But drugs, which could have been helpful to deal with HIV/AIDS in the global south, became available at a price people could afford once the global funding chair had been put in place and an arrangement found between philanthropy, private sector, and donors. And therefore, we need to think about what this pandemic means, because this pandemic has cost lives, but has dealt a death blow to the economies of many low-income countries, including those in Africa. Now, there'll be other viruses in the future. There will be other epidemics, but the epidemics don't always become pandemic. Epidemics become a pandemic, all right? Because of failures in governance or as a policy choice. I do believe that the biggest economic question we face going forward is how do we prepare for the next pandemic in a manner which is effective and equitable, so that we address global health security, both for the global north and the global south. Because the kind of responses now we have shown huge levels of global inequity, and that has been damaging to the economies. And this is what we're discussing this evening.
Okay, well, I want to thank you on behalf of the Growth Lab and everyone who tuned in, and This has been a wonderful chance to learn from you about the possibilities of African integration and various other issues. And I see that it's gotten dark over there, so we'll let you go, and always appreciate your time and your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, and thank you for your time.